Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Paul.
Thank you, Henry. And thank you all for coming out. What a nice turnout. I want to really appreciate you coming out for this. I also want to thank my friends at the Reading Reptile for supplying books, and thank our contributing authors. I'm not sure if any other authors are here who, if there are, yes. Other authors who aren't on the program tonight will be available to read as well. Just to tell you what we're going to do tonight, the prospect of sitting here and reading 3 whole stories struck us as perhaps a little long for a single program. So the idea is that we would not talk quite so loud and talk a little bit. Read some excerpts to give you a flavor of our contributors' stories, and then leave some time at the end for questions, although I'm not sure there'll be time for answers. So we'll see how that goes. One of the things, I'm really proud of this project, really excited about how it turned out. I'm thrilled with the contributions from our participants and from our other writers. We have 14 brand new, never published before stories. Take that back. One story you might have seen was published in the Kansas City Star on Sunday as kind of a preview and a teaser to the rest of the collection. That was Kevin Proofer's story, Cat in a Box. If you didn't see that, or if you want to see it, it's available online, or go back, buy a paper from Sunday. Dig it out of your recycling and try again. One of the first things people want to know is why? What is noir? I think most of you who are literate book people probably have an idea, and I will just throw out a few thoughts on the subject. Noir, I believe, is fiction that's set in the shadows of the human experience. Its characters are mean, violent, and have lost their way in the world. People have lost their moral compass. Ugly things happen to them and others, and the places where noir stories are set are equally shadowy and shady and dark, as Henry said. Things happen at night, street lights are broken, characters can't see clearly. When I approached the writers whose stories appear in Kansas City Noir, I gave them virtually no direction. I basically invited them to write a story for this noir collection and let them decide, what noir meant to them. The whole idea behind these Akashic noir books is to be fairly varied and entertaining, and to provide a kind of a mix of genre fiction, mystery, detective type fiction, and literary fiction. We have established authors, we have brand new authors and emerging authors. Some of the writers in this story have never before published fiction, and I'm thrilled to say that all of those first stories are really swell. Been getting a lot of good feedback from people who are now reading the book, and it's really heartening to get a sense that this is really coming through. One distinction I would make between genre, regular standard issue genre, mystery fiction, and noir is that in the detective story, in the regular detective story, the universe tends to kind of settle out at equilibrium by the end. A killer is apprehended, morality has returned to the community. Sometimes there's even an upbeat note of romance or hope. In the typical noir story, however, you will rarely find a happy ending. Justice is rarely served. Endings tend to be ambiguous. The moral quagmire lurches on unrelentingly. I will say, and you should know, that in this book there are many adult situations. And some, though not relentless, adult language. This book, after all, as Henry said, there are murderers in it, but it's populated by broken people, pole dancers, barbecue kings, recovering drunks, barflies, femme fatales, haunting memories, nosy neighbors, gangbangers, saloon keepers, betrayed lovers, relentless cops, psycho killers, and all manner of sharp knives. All of those things exist in many cities, of course, but the backdrop for this book is the streets of Kansas City, and in the mean streets, the dark streets, the dusty and abandoned streets, and I hope you find them to be the entertaining streets as well. Our format is going to be, I'm going to introduce each of the authors individually. We have Matthew Eck, Andres Rodriguez, and Catherine Browder. Matthew is going to go first. Matthew was recently recognized as one of the National Book Foundation's 5 under 35 writers to watch. His novel, The Farther Shore, won the Milkweed National Fiction Prize and was a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. The novel has been translated into German and Norwegian. He is a professor of creative writing and literature at the University of Central Missouri, where he is also fiction editor for Pleiades, the literary journal published there. And Matthew now will talk and read about his book, his story, The Softest Crime.
I just want you to know that my story is about the alcoholic, I think. Not the prostitute, though some people might argue with that. I don't think he has much of a moral compass either. I'm just going to read the first little bit, so here we go. I first met Alice 4 years ago in Kansas City at a conference for people affected by violent crimes. She was the daughter of a serial killer who had murdered 45 women on the West Coast, and I was the son of a serial killer who had murdered 14 people on the East Coast. We'd only gone to the conference because we'd both recently moved to Kansas City to get away from those who associated our names with the criminal way. It was our first and last attempt at one of those gatherings. There were more people there than you would imagine. We met at the bar in the lobby of the Hyatt on the last day of the conference, and then spent the next 2 weeks in and out of each other's beds. But we were a wreck together and knew it. Our grief followed us kiss to kiss and bed to bed, so we agreed at last to leave each other alone. Then last year, the day after her father died, she called me and asked if I wanted to meet for drinks at the Cashew. She said there was a movie she wanted to see that was showing tomorrow at the Art House near 20th and Grand. She asked if I'd like to see it with her before we went out for drinks. I said I would. The last big storm of the year moved through the city the night before we met. 2 feet of snow fell in 3 hours. I watched it from the window of my apartment. I'd wanted to see her in all those intervening years that fell between our first parting. I watched the snow fall and tried to caress my emotions with a 12-pack of beer. There was a point in the night where the electricity went out for about an hour. I lived in an apartment building at the corner of 41st and Walnut. From my window, I could see the lights were still on over the plaza. I laced up a pair of my old army boots and went out front with a can of beer so that I could measure the snow for myself with a good walk. I peered up into the falling snow and imagined myself an animal in the wild, a buck, a horse, a pig, a fox. I wanted to see the stars. I wanted to feel placed in my heart, but I couldn't see them because there was still too much light in the other parts of town. I threw the beer can toward the door of the apartment building and walked toward the Art Institute. It felt good to walk in the snow with my breath blooming in front of me. The campus was dark from the outage. I wanted to see the lights that usually guided someone across campus. School was out for the winter, so it was quiet. I crossed to the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art and stood in the middle of the large lawn. A few cars hummed past in the street. Mine were the first prints in the snow. Where now, I whispered to the sky. I took a step and turned myself in a circle. There are days we must feel as far from ourselves as the ocean must feel from the moon. Let me admit it here. I missed her when she was not around. Yes, we had parted ways, but we had never resolved anything. She said as much. 2 weeks together had left us shattered against the rocks of the other. But I wanted more shattering. Let me admit this as well. Alice is not her real name. Boys, note this well. Women make poor receptacles for our dreams. Girls, note this well. Men make poor receptacles for your dreams. We are not chalices to be filled with hope, yet I long for someone to prove me wrong. Her father killed 45 women in 10 years across the Pacific Northwest. My father murdered 14 women across 8 years in upstate New York and into Canada. The towns had names and so did the victims, but I will leave them out in this account, because so far as I know, there are no ghosts haunting those towns. So let them sleep where they may, those ghosts. I joined the Army shortly after my father's arrest. Part of me wanted to get away from the media. Another part simply wanted to see the world. It was only later that I recognized what I really wanted was a sense of atonement for crimes I didn't even commit. I moved to Kansas City after spending a few years watching the dirty work of empire up close in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was in and out of a marriage almost immediately. Then I read the article in the paper about the convention, and so I went, and so I met her. She was smart and shy, beautiful, of course. And then a week passed, and everything that had felt right about our being together started to feel wrong. Once again, we were owned by our guilt for reasons we couldn't explain. There was a documentary on about her father the other day. It's always returning to us, the past. Thank you.
One of the pleasures of doing this book was to connect with writers, some of whom I knew well, some of whom I hardly knew at all. I heard at least a tease for a story on the radio the other day about the idea that because of the internet and we've created ghost relationships with people, and some people we know only virtually, one way or another, and Andres Rodriguez kind of falls into that category. I've only known him by email for some time, a few years. I invited him to contribute a poem to the Kansas City Star a few years ago. And when this book project came onto my plate a year and a half ago, that's how long it's taken, I immediately had Andres on my A-list to invite to contribute a story, even though I never met him in person. And all our communications have been by email, and tonight I got to meet him in person, and it was nice to do that. The other thing that bonds me to Andres, and again, I gave very little direction to the writers about the stories I wanted, or how they should take shape. I did kind of want an idea of sort of geographical settings, so we didn't end up with 14 stories all set in Westport or on the plaza. We wanted a little bit of metro area diversity, and so I managed that as part of the other pieces of the puzzle. But when I got Andre's story and read the very first line of it, I knew we were simpatico, and I figure, just because of what it's about, that we might have had some drinks together at Milton's back in the 70s and 80s, and we'd just forgotten that part. But anyway, I was thrilled to have Andres' story. Andres is a native of Kansas City. He's the author of Night Song and Book of the Heart. In 2007, he won Poets and Writers Maureen Egan Writers Exchange Award for poetry. His poetry and prose have appeared in such journals as Harvard Review, Drunken Boat, Cortland Review, Sage Tribe, and Palabra. And since I think we went to press on this, I believe Andres has begun teaching at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So Andres Rodriguez.
Yeah, when Steve originally emailed me about the possibility of contributing a story to the then proposed anthology, I immediately thought of Milton's Tap Room, a place where I dropped a few bucks many years ago. I had no idea what I wanted to write, but as I thought about Milton's, I think I was having dim memories of The Iceman Cometh, with its room full of lushes, all kind of wondering which is better, living in a past of deception or facing some very uncomfortable realities. Now, don't get me wrong, Milton's was a wonderful place. I mean, there'll never be another place like it. But conflict is the storyteller's best friend, and I knew I needed a story with conflict. I also remembered the 70s when I started going to Milton's, and the Kansas City mob towards the end of its glory days. They owned those places in the River Key, disco music, servers and hot pants, and then the bombings that ended the River Key's brief vogue. I had a thought, what if Milton owed money to the mob? What if they were leaning on him? Then I thought, well, what if they wanted to take over his place? And I wasn't sure why. I thought maybe they were going to use it as a front. What if Milton disappeared and nobody was sure what had happened? So all I really did was sort of let my mind run with what was evoked by that situation, and then a couple of characters, Milton, of course, and a fictitious bartender named Tom. And I was able to kind of tune into his inner monologue, this bartender, who was at first frightened that Milton disappears, and then saw it as abandonment, and then finally as a means of salvation. So what I'd like to read is just a brief section from the middle of the story. So Milton has already disappeared, and a mysterious stranger has appeared, making vague threats about the bar. And Tom, who's a Vietnam vet, goes looking for his missing boss. It was nearly Easter. There had been a torrent of rain for 2 nights, knocking all the blossoms of dogwood and catalba to the sidewalk in splurges of color that soon turned black and globby. And in the storm sewers, the spring damage and leftover winter leaves lay together, seeping like an undrinkable tea. Tom asked another bartender to cover for him at the tap room and spent 2 nights driving around town in search of his boss and friend. On the 3rd night, the sky was starless and the street lights shrouded by a dark nimbus as Tom drove in circles. The instant he thought of rain, his windshield began to boil with droplets. A sudden roar filled the air. He looked up to see the collision lights of a low-flying plane diving toward the downtown airport. The sound soon faded, but Tom remembered the thunderous explosion of helicopters and supply planes knocked out of the sky. He snapped on the wipers, which squeaked like dying birds. Parking in front of the tap room at 5 a.m., he began canvassing the neighborhood. A hooker slowly passed him on her habitual toe walk up and down Main Street. He could tell she did heroin and cocaine by the living skull effect. 10 years before, she could have been Miss Teen America. The Warner Plaza apartments rose behind Milton's tap room, tall, stiff shadows waiting in cold darkness. A light here and there showed the bedroom or bathroom of an insomniac or early riser. A ritual was beginning, Tom thought, or well underway. Someone was staring at himself in a mirror, shaving perhaps, or just staring, gazing, asking, "Who are you? What do you want?" He walked past the filling station, porno store, and camera shop, heading north on Main. It rained harder now. He crossed 31st Street. A few yards ahead, the door of the Eagle's Nest Tavern swung open. Out stepped the little man in shabby clothes. He turned, saw Tom in the pre-dawn light, then began running north. Tom gave chase as fast as his gimpy knees would let him, pursuing the surprisingly fleet-footed man to the crest of Maine, then downhill, the rain folding as it ran over everything. At 29th Street, he turned east, ran a short block before turning again. He led Tom through side streets in Union Hill, all the while glancing back over his shoulder, a smile flickering in his eyes. "Motherfucker," Tom yelled with no effect, for his lungs were on the verge of collapse and the rain grew louder. Tom continued the pursuit. He was approaching a battle fury now. Despite the downpour, he could make out a blur disappearing into the wall of rain, even hear the man's splashing feet as he continued running. He ran flat out, following. Where's he leading me, he thought, trying frantically to visualize intersections, dead ends, alleys. Then he realized he was heading south to East 31st Street, which moved below the 1,000-foot TV transmitter tower, a black iron colossus visible for miles in the city. As Tom zigzagged between parked cars, he saw the little man fly across 31st, still looking back at Tom, his arms out, untouchable. He never saw the eastbound car. It came over the hill faster than it should. The sound of the impact was smothered like a cry by the surf. The car was already blocks away as Tom staggered up to where the little man lay in the street. The rainwater rolled over him with its debris of leaves, twigs, and gutter grit. A vision swam into Tom's mind, that of a soldier lying in a rain-swollen tank track. "Shit happens," he muttered. He looked up at the tower, whose flashing lights signaled threatening weather. Louder now, the rain seemed to be grinding earth and flesh together. Even in Nam, he'd never felt so abandoned. Thank you.
Great job, I would probably be remiss if some of you know that I have this thing, and I do this work about Ernest Hemingway, and especially Ernest Hemingway in Kansas City. And I don't bring that up gratuitously because he actually has a presence in this book. I did not write any of the stories, but I did write the introduction. And I thought I'd share you the beginning of that to give you a sense for how his noir spirit hangs over this book. It was winter when a young newspaper reporter, recently back from the war in Europe, holed up in a rooming house in Michigan and turned his mind back to Kansas City. He churned out a story of the kind he hoped one of the magazines would want. There was a murder. There was a mild-mannered newspaper man named Punk Alford, and there was an anguished, effete suspect who stroked a sword's edge as if it were, well, you know. Whether the budding author mailed that early effort to the Saturday Evening Post or any other magazine is unknown, but the story was never published, so Ernest Hemingway's future reputation was spared embarrassment, and his apprenticeship in writing continued a few more years. Hemingway, of course, later penned some of the great noir tales of the 1920s and 30s, notably The Killers and To Have and Have Not. Lesser known among Hemingway's fictional record are murky-toned stories such as A Pursuit Race about a wigged-out heroin addict, and God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, featuring a castration, both of which share two significant things with the unpublished Punk Alford story, namely an origin and a setting in Kansas City. I use that only to kind of set up the idea that noir fiction can be traced decades ago. There's a lot of discussion, and you can talk about the popularity of noir as a genre that was fueled by the likes of Dashiell Hammett, especially by Hollywood and especially by some of the French filmmakers who kind of got a hankering for American crime stories and kind of spun them out and delved into them and spun them back to us in the 50s and 60s. Think of Francois Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard and all those great, wonderful Jean Paul Belmondo stories that have all that attitude and black and white style and all that. All of that is real, but all of it noir, I don't believe, began with the movies, as I indicate in the book. I think noir, you can trace kind of the noir. I mean, you can trace the dark side of literature back to to the ancients, of course, but in this area you can trace it back probably to 19th century. Cowboy tales of one kind or another, and you will find in this book, the closing story in this book by Fong Nguyen is a wonderful, kind of totally unsuspected piece we got that's about Jim Pendergast in his saloon in the West Bottoms, set in about the 1880s. I think it's a great kind of feeling that the stories in this book, some of them are contemporary settings, some of them have kind of settings that are, that are clearly historical or period. Some of them goes back as far as the 19th century. Most of them are fairly contemporary. Catherine Morris is our next reader. To Catherine, I owe the great gratitude when I invited Catherine, who I knew very well as a short fiction writer. When I invited Catherine to contribute to the collection, she was the very first submitter, and her story arrived before anyone else's. And when I read it, I did a touchdown. I mean, it told me that we were on the right track, and it gave me the confidence that this thing was going to work. I really loved the story, and she really came through and filled me with confidence. Catherine is a fiction writer and a playwright. She has 2 story collections, The Clay That Breathes and Secret Lives, and a chapbook called The Heart. Her plays have been produced regionally and at the Hot Ink New Play Festival in New York City. I should add, of course, the play that the dramatic reading that I invited Catherine to put together for an international Ernest Hemingway conference that we had here in Kansas City in 2008, in which she adapted all of Hemingway's letters. There were about 30 of them that Hemingway wrote from Kansas City to his family back home in 1917 and 18 when he was a young newspaper reporter at the Kansas City Star. And I invited her to make a dramatic reading out of that my friend Nathan Darrow, a Kansas City actor at the time, performed for our people. It was really wonderful adaptation of that. So that's another personal aside. In any case, Catherine's awards include fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Missouri Arts Council, as well as short fiction awards from Kansas Quarterly, American Fiction, and Prairie Schooner. New stories appeared this spring in Nimrod and Magnolia Journal, and her book reviews appear regularly in New Letters magazine. Please welcome Catherine Browder, the author of The Incident.
Thank you, Steve. That was really a very nice introduction. Now I hope I can live up to it. Well, some people talk about writing as a labor of love, and I often find it a labor of anguish. But I would call this story a labor of fun. Some of the contributors in here are real pros in writing the noir form. But noir is not a genre I usually work in. But it turned out to be a wonderful exercise, and what I just told Steve tonight, that I wrote this story twice in the same situation, but totally different narrators and totally different points of view. The other was narrated by the investigating cop, the good cop, investigating the possibly bad one, and it turned into a police procedural, and the one he got was really, I thought, more noirish, darker, more uncertain. I wanted to read less and tell you more about the setting, since mine is the only story set in the Northeast where I live. And Steve has kind of organized these by sections of the city. And we call it Old Northeast, all sort of one word. And it's an older and somewhat neglected neighborhood between the mansions is a lot of old housing stocks and absentee landlords, which tend to be our curse. But it's also a remarkable place with considerable history, interesting architecture. And of course, it started out as the old Belgian, Italian, and Irish neighborhood. And legend had it that officials in the 50s deliberately put the highway, 3529, right through it in order to discourage all those people there whose names ended in vowels. Nowadays, people really who don't know the city are surprised we're even there. I would say basically it's sort of from Truman Road to the river and the Paseo to 435 on the east, unless you come up for a bicycling race on Cliff Drive or visit the old KC Museum, now called the Corinthian Hall. But those of us who live there feel incredible solidarity and loyalty to the area, and perhaps because it's sort of ignored. And as I was thrashing around for what the location should be as the story formed, I mentioned it in passing, the Northeast, to Steve, and he said, which you've probably forgotten, I wondered how long it would take you to get there. I live on Gladstone Boulevard, not to be confused with Gladstone, the community, which is about 8 miles north and north of the river. And I found out after we moved there that it's called, that area of Gladstone was once called Judge's Row. And in fact, my husband and I live in what was once Judge DeFeo's house. We found this out because when we moved in, our immediate neighbors to the east were the DiMaggios, and we moved there to this house in 1991. And they were the ones who told us the history of the house. The DiMaggios moved to Lee's Summit. And by the way, the DiMaggio children grew up with the DeFeo children. But the DiMaggios moved to Lee's Summit, and the Pham family from Vietnam moved in. The Pham family grew, and they moved north. And the John family moved in. Meanwhile, we're all staying put, you realize. Angie John's family is from Haiti by way of Boston. Then Angie's family moved to Gladstone, where the little girls became Stone Age. So I'm trying to give you a cycle of, this is what happens in the Northeast. Now we have a lovely young couple, newlyweds from southwest of the metro area, refugees, I like to think, from Brown-Bekistan. And Old Northeast is changing in another way, and it's becoming a Spanish-speaking area as well. And in 2 decades, it would be very useful, I'm sure, for us all to be bilingual. So it is a neighborhood of first arrivals, of newcomers, and people. I once taught for many years English as a second language, and so I have taught all the people who have lived in the Northeast, from the former Soviet Union, from Somalia, from Vietnam, from Cambodia. And so this is the backstory to the Old Northeast, and that is where the narrator, LaDonna, lives. She is very proud of her house. She feels comfortable there because she is biracial. Her airplane bungalow looks like mine, constructed of limestone brick and stucco, like mine, located north of St. John, like mine. She took pleasure in showing the neighborhood off to her partner, Juanita, showing the Concourse Park and the fountain in the Concourse Park and the colonnade in the Kennedy Memorial and the mansions along Benton and Gladstone. What she doesn't expect is Juanita's scorn for newcomers. Her family having arrived many generations ago. This scorn is in some measure one of LaDonna's first clues that her lover is not who she thinks she is. And so I just want to read you the entry into the story, which is a little edited. I won't read you the whole first scene. This is the opening to the incident. They told her the bullet had passed through the right side of her body, miraculously missing any major organ or artery. She heard them but couldn't respond. From the foot of the hospital bed, a cheery voice emerged from a white lab coat. The god smiled on you, girl. Girl? She was 34, and what did it matter what was missed when the damage felt so enormous? You're okay, aren't you, baby? Juanita was leaning in from the left, her face a blur. Everything was a blur, and her eyes felt bruised and swollen. LaDonna recognized Juanita's voice immediately, but was too drugged to register any feeling, even fear. It seemed better not to be conscious or to try to figure out who or what or where. The lab coat hovered near Juanita and then withdrew. From time to time, she heard muted electronic sounds, some sort of quiet machinery doing its job. She'd felt safe until Nita's solid frame came too close, blurring what little sight she had. Someone else entered the room and sat on a chair beside the bed. I don't think you should be talking to her, the voice said. A man's. You're still on administrative leave, officer. Juanita's shape pulled itself to its full height. LaDonna had forgotten what an imposing person Nita was, solid and broad-shouldered. LaDonna thought it was this solidity that had once attracted her until one thing led to another. Love, Nita assured her. She'd never understood that part of it, understanding instead an attraction to Nita's power and the confidence it gave her. The fact that Juanita was a cop seemed a mere sidebar, but perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps it was part of the package. She'd once joked, I've fallen for a uniform. She was never sure Nita found it funny. Nita was so quick to take offense, and she'd wondered if all Latinas were so defensive. She would have liked to ask an honest question, but was afraid of Nita's reaction. Her own mixed-race parents never showed offense, even if they felt it. They were so cool when confronted, so quick and clever. LaDonna had always strived to be like them and was unprepared for Juanita's volatile response to any perceived slight. You don't know how it is, Don, Juanita had said more than once. It's hard enough being a woman on the force, but being a brown woman on the force? Juanita would shut her eyes and shake her head, repeating herself until she'd made sure of LaDonna's support. I absolutely hear you, and you're right. Whenever Nita started in on the "it's so hard for me" speech, LaDonna turned away with a shudder. This might even have been the content of their last conversation before the fabric of their lives unraveled, just before the incident. Now her head was a muddle, and a male voice to her right was asking questions her mouth couldn't shape to answer. She would like to see his face, but couldn't turn her head. She had a feeling he wore a suit and a tie, someone from Nita's headquarters. What could she possibly say until she could remember what happened? Nita must still be in the room because the suit said something intended for her. It'd be best if you not come here until we can talk to you both, alone. With all due respect, sir, LaDonna heard the anger in Nita's voice. Miss Price is like family. Officer Juarez, I'm asking you politely to stay away. If you don't, we'll post a uniform at the door. At least her hearing was in no way impaired. There was steel in his voice. Nita didn't reply, and a slight gap of air opened up in the room. Then somewhere beyond her view, Nita cursed softly, and a door swung open. The suit shuffled some papers. A pen clicked. A hard surface like a clipboard pressed against the side of the bed, touching her arm, which she could not withdraw. I need to ask you some questions. Funny how blunt they were. No niceties, all business. And how could she answer when she wasn't sure herself? Would she be pressing charges? She shook her head. Did Officer Juarez deliberately fire her service pistol? Another shake. Was there a struggle? A nod. Could she explain? A shake. Slowly, LaDonna opened her swollen mouth and whispered, accident. The man leaned forward, his ear hovering unpleasantly near her mouth. His hair was reddish blonde and clipped short, and she thought she saw tufts of hair in his ear. Acid rose to her throat. An accident. An accident? He repeated. LaDonna caught the tone of disbelief. She nodded and repeated faintly, yes. Thanks.
I want to thank Catherine, Andres, and Matthew again. Henry and the people at the library. Thank you for coming. Let's go sign some books.